Well, good morning. Welcome to day 3 of Changing Practices for Changing Times. It's Wednesday, August 12th, 2020. We appreciate that you are here this morning, and we're looking forward to working with you. Today, we are going to have Becky's teaching demonstration coming up very quickly. We will then think again, going through that collaborative response and reflecting on her demonstration and some ways that we can connect it to our own practice. Later in the morning, Dave will be joining us again to talk about compelling questions. And then in the late morning, Roy and Becky will be talking about formative assessment of inquiry. And this afternoon, during our 1 to 2 o'clock technology workshop, for those that might be interested, we're going to think more about building visual arguments through infographics. So using tools like Infogram, Piktochart. There are a number of others that we can use, Visme, Canva, and we will think about how we can combine data to tell stories and make compelling arguments as we move into that informed action. With that, I'm going to jump right in and kind of get started. We're going to try a tool today for our opening activity called Pear Deck. In the chat, as well as in the agenda, I'm putting in a link to Pear Deck. And if for some reason this does not work for you and get you right to where you need to be, please let me know. What should be showing up for you when you land on that page? You might have a little thing that says like, oh, you've got to like give a happy face or a thumbs up or something like that. But very soon after that, you should land on something that looks like a map of Michigan. And so the main activity that we're doing this morning is called I See, I Think, I Wonder. But to get started, I'm going to invite you to kind of show where you're at in the state by using a drawing tool. And then I'm going to take a quick little pulse check, temperature check, using another tool in Pear Deck, and then we'll move into our main activity. So I see that there are 14, 15 of us connected. We're getting there, 17 of us connected. I'll wait just a moment more before I launch the class and get us started. And again, Pear Deck is an add-on for Google Slides. It's one of the tools that are one of those freemium models where you can use it for free. You get a certain number of features. I just went for it this summer. I subscribed for 3 months to kind of see what it was like. I knew I was doing a lot of virtual PD this summer. I like it. It's pretty good, especially if you're going to be doing synchronous class sessions and you want to really get students engaged, which I'm going to try to model for you with our activity this morning. All right, I hope that most of you are in there. If you're not, the link is still on the agenda. It's in the chat. We're going to get started. All right, so hopefully what you're seeing is that you should have the opportunity here. Oh, did I not put the drawing on there? Oh, I forgot. I somehow didn't activate it. Okay, well, what I was hoping to have happen in this first slide was that we were all going to be able to put a little dot on our where we're joining in Michigan, but for some reason I lost the drawing. Let me see if I can add that in. No, I don't want to mess with it. I don't want to mess with it. I put that in there. I thought I'd done that. So see, even the techie person can sometimes have trouble. That was just a warm up. Here's another type of warm up that you can do. Hopefully what you're seeing now is this stress check where you've got like this purple bar and you can kind of move your bar and you can tell me, where are you at this morning? How are things going? Are you kind of in the middle? Are you feeling really good? Are you over on the side? And what I can then do as teacher is I can kind of get, I can do different views of this. And for instance, right now, I can share with you. I want to just kind of see like, okay, how's everybody feeling? And hopefully you are going to now see that. Let me put this over in my Google Chrome window so you can see what I'm seeing. If this isn't showing up on your bar, I as teacher can see here's where all my students are at right now. And I can see there's somebody here that's feeling a little stressed. So what I might do is say something like, hey, if you're feeling a little stressed and you need some help, send me a private message in the chat. I'd like to be able to help you. It looks like most of us are in the zone right now. Maybe at that moment, I would kind of pause and say, hey, let's just take a moment. Let's take a few deep breaths. Let's get focused. Maybe you're just coming out of your other virtual class session. Here we go. Okay, let's get ready. So there's another tool, and I'm sorry that the drawing tool with the little dot drop in on the other one didn't quite work the way I'd hoped that it would. But here's our main activity. We want to get students focused. We want to spark their curiosity. We want to get them thinking about what it is that they're going to be able to do and be thinking. And so what I have done is kind of a matchup of something I think Becky's going to introduce later. And I'm going to combine it with a visible thinking routine called I See, I Think, I Wonder. And we're going to use it around a document. In this case, we're going to be looking at a painting. And what I'll tell you is that on the screen you're about to see, I'm going to just block out different segments of it. And we're going to quickly kind of go through. I'm going to show you where the segment is in the painting. And then I'm going to blow it up and invite you to add just a couple thoughts. You can either write an I see and fill in the blank. This is what I see. I think, fill in the blank about what you think. Or I wonder, fill in the blank about what you wonder. All right, so I think we're in a pretty good place. And again, I could do the stress check again, say, is everybody ready? We took a few deep breaths. Do you want to change your settings? We're good. Oh, good, someone moved over to the green. Thank you so much. All right, here we go. So I'm moving pretty quickly. I'd probably be a bit slower with students, but I think you can kind of get the sense of it. So on your screen now, you should have a place. Okay, it's not launched. It's not launched the spot. All right, well, let me try this. So, okay, so you saw, here's our image. Here's our one chunk of our image. And you can either write in something you see or something you think or something that you wonder about that one spot in the image. So I'll let you take a moment to drop your answer in there. And what I will show you while that is all unfolding is what Pear Deck offers as a teacher dashboard. So in my second screen here, I have kind of a smaller little dashboard that has popped up, and I'm actually able to see all of the comments that my students are writing. So I can see people are talking about colonists. I wonder if they're going in the same direction. Where are they going? I see a rural community. And what I can do, I can even go so far as to say I would like to, push these responses out on screen and show them to people. So I think if I do that, yeah, there we go. So now you should be seeing on screen some of the responses that are showing up. What's nice about this too is that let's say that there was one person whose response I really wanted to highlight. I could take that one. I'm going to show that one. I could show that one, and I could show this one. And now watch what happens. Those are the only three that are going to show up. So if I have a kid who's kind of being naughty over here, and I see that they've written something that's not really appropriate, I can say, all right, that's enough. I'm not putting that one up on screen. But I can completely hide the response too, and I can also provide feedback. So I can, and I'm not going to do that right now to every student, but I can write in the Pear Deck. I can send quick little messages out to people. All right, so we're gonna advance here really quick. We're gonna look at the next segment. And I'm gonna add in another wondering prompt after this. So take a look at that. And of course, you have one more chance here to jot something in. So what do you wonder about that segment? And clearly I'm going very fast right now. I would be much more deliberate, especially if I was working with upper elementary or middle school students, but even with high school students, I would not be going nearly as fast as I am this morning. This is just a warm up for us. I too, anonymous koala, wonder why she is floating and holding a book. Yeah, so yeah, I wonder how we're going to connect this to our picture with the topic of our discussion. I wonder what book she's holding in her hand. Interesting. Ooh, why is this an angel imagery? Okay, so again, I could project these up on the Pear Deck and do some things like that. Again, I'm going to project through quickly right now. Again, just for sake of time, I would then move to that last image, and you would have that opportunity to see that last chunk there. We would do another wondering. I could then pull the final image up and say, okay, now everybody, here's the big image. What do we see? And if we had maybe talked a little bit and compared and contrast, what do we see comparing the colonists as compared to the Native Americans and indigenous peoples? What do we notice about the color of the sky and all those kinds of things? And I could throw in another kind of critical thinking prompt at the end. And so I might say, as you think about this drawing, for instance, how do you feel, maybe I could use a prompt like, what are 2 things that you've learned? So I could throw this in here. And now hopefully on your screen, this is what was supposed to appear on that first slide with that Michigan map, where you could just put a little dot on the map. But here you should have the pencil or painting tools along the bottom, but you'll also see that you have a text box tool. And so you can use the text box tool and you can click that on one area of the slide or the other. And then again, I would prompt, having gone through all this, I see, I think, and I wonder. I might provide some kind of summarizing sentence stem, some kind of comparing and contrasting sentence stem, something like that to get students working and summarizing. And again, what's kind of cool is that, I can see all the things that are emerging on the different slides. I see some people have deleted some of their responses, and yeah, so then there's one here that I might display and say, okay, here's one person who's starting to think about issues of race as we're talking about westward expansion. Okay, what else are we seeing other people are bringing up in our responses so far? So someone said something about the issues of going west versus manifest destiny and things like that. So I can end on time and we can have Becky begin. Let me just pause for a moment. I'm going to end our slideshow. This will probably end your Pear Deck session and say, thanks, give a rating or something like that. What's cool, you can see in my screen sharing here, if I wanted to, I could save all of your responses. And actually, if you were logged in and I had your names, these would all turn into Google Docs, and I could see what every one of my students had written in their Pear Deck sessions, kind of as a formative evaluation tool as well. With that, the big point though is I want to think about that see, think, and wonder type of recommendation. And you could use Padlet, as we saw yesterday with Dave. You could just use a Google Doc. I happened to build it into this Google slide deck, and I tried to mesh off of what I knew Becky was going to be doing today with this whiteout activity and give a way to extend that. Maybe we have just a moment. One person, quick reaction to this activity. How might you use it in your own classroom with your own kids, whether you were to use Pear Deck or Google Docs or Padlet or something like that? A quick reaction from someone as we get ready to cue Becky and start our teaching demo.
I think this could work well with like political cartoons, especially for our lower level learners, that they could go through and work through it together.
Yeah, so you could do a similar activity with political cartoon. All right, cool. Well, I know that's just a quick intro, and if people have questions about Pear Deck, I see there's a few questions emerging in the chat that I will definitely respond to, but we want to get right away to our teaching demonstration. So Becky, I know you sent me some links. If you need me to drop things in the chat or link them to the agenda, let me know. I will make sure that you are elevated to co-host so you have all the screen sharing capabilities that you need. And is there anything else that I can do to help you get started? All right, so Becky, if you're set to go, you'll go ahead and unmute. We're seeing your screen and we are ready for your teaching demonstration this morning.
Awesome. Thank you, sir. If you could drop the links in the chat as we go, that would be terrific. Thank you. I want to talk about two different strategies today that I have used quite often and seem to be real receptive with students. And we're going to talk about how these really kind of link into or are a part of some of the DLEs that we've been talking about so far this week. And then I think you're also going to see that connection when Roy and I are talking later on this morning about the formative assessment process. So we're going to jump right in. You are going to want to have in front of you the PowerPoint presentation that Troy is linking. You're also going to want to possibly, if you want to dive right into your standards, you may want to have the standards open. You definitely want to have the DLEs or the GELN document in front of you, because we're going to be referring to that. And that's probably enough to get us started. There's going to be a couple of other documents as we go. But if you are if you were to take a look at the state standards, not just in the grade level or the course that you teach, but if you were to take a look across other content areas, if you were to take a look at the other, some of the other grade levels, you would find that typically in the state standards, at least in our state standards, as well as in some of the textbooks that are used, that a lot of the outlines that are designed to present that information are almost always written from a spec perspective, or they use the writers, the authors will often use a spec anagram or one like it. We're going to talk about that in just a second. You will probably be able to relate it to another anagram that maybe you have heard in the past or that you have your students working with. So this is just another option. So if you take a look at, again, keeping with our IDM that we have been working on all week, you will take a look at this 8th grade content expectation that is asking about comparisons between the Northeast region of the country and the South. And we want students to be able to compare and contrast those regions, but how? And so again, this is where anagrams like SPEC come into play, because it gives us an answer to how do we want students to be comparing and contrasting. So in this case, we really want students to be focusing on the social and the economic systems of those two regions, and then kind of bring in another region, the Western frontier, with respect to geography and climate, and how that impacted the development of, and then you can see all of those bullet points. And as you look at those bullet points, you're probably starting to think about economic terms. You're probably starting to think about concepts in geography like migration, immigration. You're probably starting to think race relations, class relations. That really has to do with social structures. So as you can see, if you take a look at that content expectation, we really do have some social, some political, and some economic perspectives that are coming into play. And that's what SPEC is really all about, is helping students look for and recognize those perspectives as they're working with content. So SPEC is a strategy that that was developed many years ago by a good friend of mine, Anthony Fitzpatrick. Anthony and I worked on several Teaching American History grants together. And someone said to him one day, Anthony, you should put these together in a book. And so he did. And so his first book, Social Studies Can Be Spectacular, is where SPEC first appears. And there are other strategies there as well. And then he followed it up with another book, Text Inspection on the Core. And so in that book, his strategies are related to the Common Core standards, particularly in ELA. And if you've spent any time with the Common Core, you know that there is that piece, that additional appendix that deals with or is addressing the social studies and history areas. And so he makes a lot of those connections. So today we're going to check out in a little bit more detail SPEC as a strategy, and also ways that we can use SPEC to really get to perspectives. So what I would like you to do first is on just a scrap sheet of paper, think about all of the reasons for folks moving west. Think about all of the factors that influenced Western migration or the move westward expansion. Just take a minute and jot down whatever you can think of. Okay, and let's take another 10 seconds to kind of finish your thought. Okay, and I would like to pick on a few people this morning to share out maybe one of the factors that they thought of. Michelle, could you start us off this morning and list give us one of the factors that you might have written down?
You know what? Usually I love to talk, but right now I can't.
Okay. Malange, what do you have?
Yes, so I wrote a couple of things down here. For sure, I talk about the idea of search for a better life.
Okay. Chris, what do you have?
Just simple curiosity.
Ooh, I like that. Curiosity. All right. Christy, what's on your mind or on your paper?
Farming, food.
Oh, farming. Okay. All right. So those are some great examples. Thank you for being willing to share those out this morning, folks. Let's see. And I have no idea. There we go. Why this is not working. Did you have some of these listed? think about this list. Think about the list that you made, because we're going to come back to that list and we're going to do something with that list in just a second. So when we talk about the anagram spec, this is what spec is really all about. It's breaking down the different perspectives and helping students organize those perspectives. And we're going to kind of play that forward in just a little bit. So as you can see, social stands for social, political, economic, and cultural. Now, some of you have probably worked with other anagrams. I know that for a while, G Persia was very commonly known, and a lot of world history folks worked with G Persia. There have been others as well, but I like spec because it's simple. I like spec because even students at the elementary levels can work with this anagram. I have seen, I've been in classrooms where third grade students are able to use spec as a classifying strategy. So you can kind of see, I don't want to read the slide to you, but social, political, economic, and cultural, someone will always ask, what's the difference between social and cultural? And can students differentiate? And the answer is yes, they can. Social, when we are talking about that, when we present that to students, we're really talking about larger groups, people acting and living in those groups, and some of the large issues that kind of predominate a society. Issues like gender or class or economic status. Cultural has more to do with technology, arts, institutions of a group of people at a given time. So for example, music, language, those would be considered cultural aspects or characteristics. So spec really can help students look at a topic, a group of people, a concept, and be able to classify their thinking. But it also helps them think about it from more than one standpoint. So let's take some of that content that you had written down on your scrap paper and begin to analyze it for its significance with regard to spec. So for example, Colin, what did you have? Could you list maybe, or give us one of the factors that you had listed? And could you tell us where you might place it on this spec chart?
Yeah, one of them was lack of economic opportunities in the cities. And so that would be under the E category. I also put racial/ethnic discrimination. And so that could be more social or political.
Absolutely. Thank you. Those are perfect examples. Let's hear from maybe one more person. Allie, are you willing to share maybe something that you had down?
Sure. I just had to get on the screen where I could unmute. I had that idea that land was so rare in Europe that memories of that, the idea of just being able to own acres was incredibly appealing. So probably economics for that one.
Absolutely. And let's do one more. Matt, good morning. What do you have for us?
Well, one I have that hasn't already been used is lack of emotional tie to the land / like a willingness to relocate. So I think that would fall kind of under the social, that they weren't necessarily tied like they were in Europe to their land for years and years and years. There was a willingness to go explore and try new things. So I think that would fall under the social. So, lack of emotional tie to your land. because you didn't have any.
Absolutely. Thank you very much. So you can see that there's a great way to work with SPEC. One of the things that you all did this morning was not only did you tell us which part of the anagram that you're placing your factor or factors, but you're also giving a justification as to why. And that's the beauty of SPEC, is that there is not a right or wrong answer. But again, the conversation comes from the rationale that is being shared. Let's also talk for a second about the role of geography. When I was working with my Giants team writers, and if you're familiar with Giants at all, you know that it has to deal with, it's a set of units and lessons. And the main purpose of the creation of Giants was really to make sure that geography was not forgotten, particularly when we're teaching history. Because in some instances, when you think about the amount of content, it tends to be an add-on. And so we didn't want that to happen. And some of the writers, as we were building these units of Giants, said, you know, geography really plays an important piece in all of this. You can't have history without geography. And so we wanted to really add on to SPEC because the geography we feel is kind of left out. And so the writers of Giants really were the ones who started to think about GSPEC. Let's look at some of the important conditions of geography and connections. And those are the two that geographers are always wondering about, are the conditions and the connections of places and to other places. And so GSPEC really gets students to focus on particular parts of geography that really come into play. So for example, a 5th grade teacher would use GSPEC because they, especially in places where they want to talk about the development of our country and how the geography really impacted the social, the political, the economic, the cultural ways of life in a particular place or region. And so I had just listed here on this chart a couple of examples that an 8th grade teacher who really wanted to focus on the impact of geography might list onto that chart. For example, the Mississippi River would be one, or hydroelectric power for generating power for factories in the East and the East Coast. And so GSPEC is just a way to really acknowledge the role that geography plays in the historical happenings of what the time period that is being studied. So let's take a look at the SPEC strategy and how does it align with the disciplinary literacy essentials. And so I pulled out just a few quick examples of where that alignment is pretty tight with the DLEs. So again, if you are looking at your GELN document, if you were to look at number 3, if you were to look at number 4, because obviously when students are reading primary sources, secondary sources, when we ask them to analyze, we can use the SPEC strategy to really help them establish and think about patterns of thinking in history. We also are teaching students to apply those disciplinary tools whenever they're working with text. So if students are looking at primary source documents, how do you read like a historian? Same thing applies with the writing process. So we want students to be able to write like historians, to engage in the work that historians do, and that is reflected, represented in the writing that they do themselves about history. As I've said before, students of all ages can begin to utilize SPEC. Now, obviously, the conclusions that a fifth grader can draw and that of a high school sophomore or junior who's taking U.S. history are going to vary quite a bit. But the strategy is useful at almost every level. And it's the sophistication that becomes more developed over time. The key is that you have to scaffold that skill. Once you have scaffolded that skill, students can approach content with a plan. And that's the biggest benefit, is that it really helps students organize their thinking. So if we move beyond, okay, let's use SPEC in a chart format to generate ideas. What are some of the other ways that we can use the strategy? We can use it to build graphic organizers with students. We can ask them to engage in scavenger hunts. I want you to look at these 3 documents with a partner, and I want you to find 3 political ideas that you see from these writings or these documents, these pictures, right? So those are some of the examples of the ways that you can go past just generating ideas. I find, even when I'm working with my college students, that if I help give them the SPEC look-fors in their reading, they can get through their reading much faster with more purpose. And even after the first read through, they have more information that they can share. So how does it transfer over to the writing process? One of the things that I think is really important when we are working with the SPEC strategy is to help students use those ideas that they might have in a chart and help them develop thesis statements and conclusions that have to do with the documents, the work that is being studied at the time. I love this diagram because it's something that a lot of students, it really makes sense or can resonate with them. And so often I will use SPEC not only as a strategy, but also as an organization for writing. So I might tell the students, you need to make sure that your paper, if I'm having them do a written piece of work, or if I have them do a presentation, anything, I tell them that they need to structure their outlines based on SPEC. So they know that they need to have social, political, economic, and cultural references that help build upon their thesis statement. And that really helps them when they'll say, I'm not sure where I want to start, or I'm not sure which angle I want to take. The SPEC organization framework can really help them think about how they want to organize their writing and flow from one perspective, perhaps, into another. So if we go back to what we were talking about yesterday with regard to those indicators in the C3 framework, Dimension 2, if we think about SPEC, let's go back to one of the indicators that we talked about, which has to do with perspective and helping students practice their analysis of perspectives of people during different historical eras. So I want to focus on, obviously, westward expansion as our time period, right? How do we do that? So if SPEC or GSPEC can help us more deeply understand the factors that influenced the perspectives of people at a particular point in time, think about everything you listed just a few minutes ago. There's another strategy that can also help us better understand how perspectives were reflected through a lot of the documents, a lot of the artifacts that we're dealing with. So I would like to also practice today with a whiteout strategy. So what is whiteout? Obviously, whiteout is a method of document analysis, and it's designed to help students work with primary source documents, but secondary source documents can also be used. And I have to say, in Anthony's work with whiteout, he had used a lot of primary and secondary source documents with regard to the topic of history. And I thought, you know, I wonder if you could do the same thing with geography, you know, or obviously with civics or economics. And so I started to play around, and you can. I created several documents, several whiteouts that had to deal with geographic topics, manipulation of some maps, taking a look at some of our important documents that we use in civics. And so while Anthony might tell you, you know, whiteout is really designed for just the historical perspective, I disagree. So one of the pieces that I really like about whiteout, and I think you'll see this come through in just a minute when we work on our actual whiteout activity, is that it really allows students to compare and contrast historical events by sorting through contestable and non-contestable facts and interpretations. You see that if you use a whiteout strategy, students will really read closer than they probably have previously, because they're really trying to understand the language that they're reading. They're trying to gather some deeper understanding of a particular perspective, whether it is cultural in nature, whether it's political. You get the idea. And it really helps students connect relations between concepts, and sometimes can even help students recognize patterns in history. And it's really easy to do. Sometimes it takes a little while because you have to find a document that's going to work, but it's easy to do once you find a document. So you simply select a document that makes reference to historical content, or if you're teaching geography class, I would say geographic content. It can involve an event that you've already talked about. It can talk about something or address a topic that you're going to be talking about. So that doesn't matter. And what you want to do is you want to choose a passage. You don't want to use the entire document. You want to use a portion of it. And you want it to be a passage that will raise a significant issue. Okay, and you can take a look on the screen. There are just some examples of issues that tend to apply to history over a wide span of time. And if you think back to the brief discussion we had yesterday about history themes, right? And that's really where history themes can come into play. So once you've selected your passage, you remove the bibliographic material that's going to help students reveal maybe the author, You want to reveal, you want to make sure that you're removing the dates, any kind of who, what, where, when, why. You want to selectively white out that piece or a couple of pieces of that information. The key for students is in the collaboration, right? Because they will bring inevitably a wide variety of differing opinions to the table when they are having a conversation about the whiteout task. They tend to incorporate historical knowledge into their conversations, and they also will often allude to prior knowledge that they have that'll come through in their conversations as well. So you're going to have some contextualization going on, and obviously if it doesn't occur within the groups and the conversations, you as the instructor have the opportunity to really help students identify some of the issues that are going on that might not have been in the document. Sometimes we know that if we ask students to read the silences, what they can identify that's left out of a document is sometimes just as important as to what was put in the document. So here's a whiteout, and it has to, it relates to westward expansion. What I would like you to do for the next 2 minutes, right, is to read that excerpt. Again, it's an excerpt from a letter that was written to President Cleveland in 1886. So as you're reading the excerpts of this letter, be thinking about which of the people below might have been the author of that letter. So if you could take just a couple of minutes to read through and make your decision. And then we're going to go into breakout groups so that you can discuss your rationale for the decision that you have made. So I'll give you a couple minutes. Hopefully by now you've had a chance to read the excerpts in the red box, and you may have already made your decision as far as the speaker, or excuse me, of the writer, the author of that letter. Once you've made your selection, make sure that you jot down a thought or an idea that represents your rationale. So if you selected letter A, why? What was it about the excerpts that you read that made you really hone in on letter A? If you could take just a couple minutes and jot down some phrases to help with your rationalization, that will help when we get into groups in just a second. Okay, and if you can work on finishing up your thought in the next 10, 15 seconds. I'm going to right now defer to Troy. He's going to remind us again of how we do our renaming, because that will help him very quickly put us into breakout groups depending on the answer that you selected. So for example, if you chose letter A, you will want to rename yourself with a 1 in front of your name. Obviously, if you selected letter B, you'd be 2. C would be 3, D would be 4. So Troy, I'm going to turn it over to you so that you can help us with the renaming and the breakout process. Once you're in your breakout groups, you are going to want about 10 minutes so that everyone has a chance to talk about their rationale. And keep note of the rationale, because I think you're going to find that the rationale you had for your selection is probably very different than the others in your group. Troy?
Yeah, perfect. So again, for those of us that are not language arts and math teachers, if you want to be A, you're going to put a number 1 in front of your name. If you want to be B, number 2, C equals 3, D equals 4. Oh, see, I can't even type and talk at the same time. You know what I'm getting at. D equals 4. There we go. And remember to do that if you need to. I'm going to stop your screen sharing, Becky, really fast so I can just remind people where that control is. You should see when you highlight over your name, you click the More button and then you rename yourself. So we'll give you just a moment to do that. And also, Becky, I took the liberty of making a little spot in the agenda for people to do some note taking during their group breakout. I don't know that you are necessarily requiring any one person to be the note taker, but I was thinking that maybe group A could take some notes there, group B could take some notes there, group C and group D. And that might help them as they come back and then do their own GSPEC as well. All right, well, I'm going to start making the breakout rooms. It'll take me just a moment to do that. Thank you for renaming yourselves appropriately. Any questions about the activity for Becky while I'm making the rooms and getting people ready to go? All right. there are quite a few people that either just when I opened up the little breakout room setting hadn't named themselves yet, or were just getting to that point. So if you happen to hang out here in the main room, I will get you where you need to go. No problem. You'll just tell me which one of the 3 or 4 rooms you want to go to. And Becky, we said they were going to be in those rooms for about 8 to 10 minutes or so talking. All right, fantastic. We'll see you back here in about 10 minutes.
What were the groups again?
All right, welcome back from your breakout rooms and your discussions with the whiteout activity. And we're going to kind of bring it home here for our last few moments of Becky's teaching demo. And Becky, just remember to unmute yourself there when you come back from those breakout rooms. There you go.
I'm sorry, I keep hitting that button, and like the 3rd time, every time it works. Those of you who were in Group A, I hope that you had enough time to kind of share your rationale for why you selected letter A as the person who wrote that letter to the president. But what I'm curious about is, what did you learn as you were listening to each other? What kind of talk did you hear? Does one person from Group A want to kind of talk through your rationale and how you arrived at the rationale?
In taking a look at, I don't have the screen open, in the choice that we chose at first, we found similarities with wondering development at stake. So will the land be sold? Other connections that we made resided here for years. So talking about people, but what people? And are we talking about Native Americans or another group? Possibly, but probably Native Americans. And then making a statement in there having to do with wanting to grow and prosper. So wondering, do they, or will whatever decision is made, will it not allow them to grow and prosper? But then we circled up and went in another direction.
Okay. Did anyone from your group end up focusing on the kind of the economic side of things, that if the government were to sell the land to the railroad companies, what might ensue from that?
Yeah, I can speak to that quick. That was brought up with the 2nd paragraph specifically, where it mentions the development of mining, ranching, and grazing properties. So it just sounded like that was definitely a concern as well. But I think our major takeaway was just how important context is in general, because it can be construed in so many different ways without those small details.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. Group B, does anyone want to speak about the discussion that took place as you were sharing your rationale for your answer?
Sure, I can. So we were looking at several different things. We were looking at some of the vocabulary use, like when they said land rush, and we were looking at who was speaking, and we thought that kind of seemed like military verbiage. So we were looking at maybe it came from military speaker. We were looking at some of the words that jumped out at us, like specifically referenced, please support General Mills. So we thought maybe that was the person trying to support him. We tried to use process of elimination, looking at what would tie in most connected with, they wanted the land use for prosperity. And like the first one was saying like against the railroads, but the railroads might have like helped perpetuate the ability to mine. And so we were thinking that perhaps with process of elimination, it was the strongest land use connection. And looking at wanting to have a land rush to expand opportunities for mining, ranching, and grazing. We were trying to figure out who would agree or oppose with this. They didn't want to keep the country in a state of ferment, so they wanted to change it into something that would be more economically prosperous. And then The last part, though, we were kind of saying, well, but in the first section, we're looking at the troubles they're referring to. And so then we thought maybe it could have been someone else speaking, trying to either relocate or to, you know, perpetuate slavery in order to continue with that. So that was our little like, but perhaps, but we still stuck with B based on those other pieces.
So you talked about a lot of different thought processes that went on in your group. Everything from vocabulary and language to context clues to being able to contextualize what they could read in the letter. So you've got a lot of different processes going on. And I'm going to get to group D in just a second, but again, those are one way that you can formatively assess where your students are at with their ability to analyze primary source documents like this one. You will learn so much in those conversations that will really help give you a gauge as to where your students are at and where you want to take them. Group C, it was me and Angela. We had a really interesting, great discussion actually about the issue of slavery in the context of westward expansion, and how often that issue of slavery, even though it's almost as prominent in the westward expansion as it is when we're talking about the years leading up to the Civil War between the North and the South. But slavery doesn't always get the emphasis during that particular time period. So I want to go right into group D because I want to give you guys enough time to share your thoughts.
We used, you know, we all kind of used somewhat similar strategies. A lot of us looked at the person first. And we're like, well, it says here that they've lived here a long time. So it's not going to be a general, and it's not going to be Douglas because they didn't live in New Mexico. And then we all kind of picked up individual lines, like it's true there are but few of them, which right away we're like, well, then it can't really be about land removal because this letter is about, but there are few of them. And so quite a few of us started thinking that it was B. We started thinking that it was A, and then we kind of found ourselves drawn to D. But I think, and someone else can jump in, we kind of went through like, we know why the other ones are wrong, so therefore ours has to be right. Not like ours jumped out immediately as it had to be right. We kind of went process of elimination. But if anyone else wants to jump in.
Yeah, there were just clues in the text, that last paragraph about, you know, about lives and property. So, and the state of ferment, that constant sort of worry that they're going to be, you know, murdered in their beds by the natives.
Excellent. And again, those of you who did end up in breakout room 4 who selected choice D, that is in fact the correct answer. You will often hear students, they'll say, in general, they'll say, well, you know, we just went through this process of elimination. But if you get that, push them further, because as Matt, as you were doing, you were kind of talking about how and why you eliminated each of the other choices. So don't let them off the hook with, well, you know, we went through and we just figured that this one made the most sense. Well, why? Because again, you'll learn so much more in those conversations. And it also really does help students understand the importance of word choice, which, who knows, we hope that that resonates whenever they get to a writing task about history, and that carries over. So again, thank you all for participating. You had some great discussions, I have no doubt. I hope that whiteout is a strategy that you will consider using. I can tell you that I have never had a group of students not love the activity. because they love to get up and move into groups, and they love to, at first blush, what they'll say is they love to argue. But they suddenly realize, you know, that, ooh, gee, there's a lot more to, you know, making a claim than I first thought. So with that, I don't want us to run over too much, but I do want to address any questions that you might have, either about SPEC or about whiteout.
All right. Well, we're practicing our good Zoom wait for the microphone time. Looks like everybody's good for the moment. So, all right, let's give Becky a round of applause. Thank her for teaching demo. Awesome. Great. So we're going to take just an extra 5 minutes. We hope you'll all be willing to do this. I've got the breakout rooms ready to go. I've got the links to the collaborative response letters ready to go. So you're going to be in that group until 10:35. And then we will take our break from 10:35 to 10:50. So unless anyone has any questions, I'm going to hit the magic button and send you into the rooms. One thing I noticed today, and I do apologize, Michelle, when we made our Flippity the other day, we had forgotten to add you to our list, but here are roughly who is going to be in each room. And Michelle, I think I have assigned you, where do I assign you, Michelle? You're going to room 2. All right, so you'll know at least who your partners are in your room. You'll have 15 minutes to offer your collaborative response to Becky, and we will go from there. So enjoy your conversations, and we'll see. You can kind of just plan at 10:35. You can step away, grab your coffee, do what you need to do. We'll all be back together here in the main room at 10:50. Enjoy. All right. Well, welcome back, everybody, from your break. And we appreciate the collaborative responses that you offered to Becky's teaching demonstration. And as a segue, getting ready for Dave, maybe we can just hear one person who had something that really jumped out at you as you thought about the way that Becky used the whiteout activity, the GSPEC framework. Who has one idea to share from your collaborative letter writing that you were just engaged in?
In the first group I was in, we talked about how if students could Google the answer, the whole thing would kind of derail a little bit. But then fortunately in the second group I was in, we talked about how some people did Google it and there was still really great conversation and 2 different answers were come up with. So it's nice to know that that deep thinking can still happen.
That does raise a really interesting point. I think I dropped into your breakout room at the moment you all were talking about that. And I think even if some students were to do that, you could then continue to push them and say, all right, so all right, well, you found out who it was, but now let's ask some deeper questions about why that matters. And so the answer to the question that Becky was posing in this activity is not a Googleable answer necessarily. And I think that's the other thing we need to teach our students. So if Google or Siri or the other voice assistant who's sitting on my shelf, and I won't name right now, can answer the question, then those are not necessarily the kinds of questions we want to be asking, which is a perfect segue to Dave. So, all right, I'm going to let you take it away, Dave. Thank you, Christy. And I will make sure that you have co-hosting privileges here. Give me just 1 second.
Thank you, Troy. Like many of you, I'm sure over the course of the shutdown, we had some Zoom pandemic parties. And because Troy just did what he did, I learned something, and I'm going to see if it works right now. Hey, Alexa, play Troy's party mix. No, nothing? Darn it. Oh man, yeah.
Oh, it's playing. I'm just keeping my microphone on mute right now. Thank you very much.
So just be aware of that
Hear it
when
in
your
the background there.
come back. Just be aware of that.
That's too funny.
We learned that with a Cadillac Footlighters booze cruise party trivia night, and one of the participants was talking about how was ordering his Alexa to turn the lights on and turn the lights off and things like that. So, you know, I ordered it to, hey Alexa, play I'm Sexy and I Know It at loudest possible volume, and all of a sudden it was boom, like. So, you know, that's some fun. If you have any of those devices with your at your home, if you end up teaching from home this year, keep them out of the room, because your students will probably figure it out pretty quickly. And I'm sorry about that, Troy, but as soon as you said,
I think I'm going to
another
put my
device-
headset back on now. Thanks a lot, Dave. That's great.
I'm actually kind of bummed that he's muted, because I really want to know what's on Troy Hicks's Jam Out mix. I think we all have one, but you know, what's on it? I have thoughts, and maybe that's a compelling question for us later, you know, to study and potentially answer. But I'm going to jump into compelling questions now from the standpoint that I was going to start yesterday. It works better to flow together in one presentation, but it's also going to go really quick. So I'm going to point out right now that in the agenda document, I posted the link to a handout that you guys may end up finding useful. So as I scroll down the page to Wednesday, which at this point is, since we keep doing this, page, I believe, what page am I on? Page 14 of the agenda document where we're sharing everything. There's a handout called Types of Compelling Questions, and I'll get to that in a little bit, but you may not be able to read my slides, and I am going to go through it kind of quickly. So that's yours as a guide when we get there, if we need to. I'm also going to be very intentional today about sharing the right screen from the get-go. So I'm going to do that now and go ahead and launch my keynote and get us going. Sharing from my iPad again today. And if someone could just either confirm in the chat or by nodding your head, you see a picture of a sunset right now.
You do see a picture.
Perfect. Perfect. So I'm going to go ahead and get started with this. So some of you are going for those extra sketches as part of this presentation. And if you are, that means you're probably building an inquiry. And one of the things we're going to leave you with on Friday is the steps for filling out an IDM template, because a lot of people look at it and just go, oh, I start at the top and work the way down. But if you follow the process that Kathy Swan, John Lee, and SG Grant put together, it actually, you start in the middle and then you move up and then you move down, and you know, it's not a start here and go to the bottom process. But today I'm going to teach you how to get from, I know I want to write an inquiry and I know I want to write it about this topic, down to how do I actually write a compelling question about it. But to do that, I want to make sure you guys have a little bit of background about some of the elements of a compelling question. And just like yesterday, I want to point out that this questioning piece in particular is going to hit several of the literacy essentials. For example, we start right off with inquiry-based instruction. Like I put on the slide, it's right there in the name. Essential 2, as part of an inquiry, you're going to read diverse text, and there'll be plenty of opportunities for your students to do so in your social studies classroom. And those texts are going to be a variety of complexities, and your students may struggle with some of them. There's also connections to Essential 3, that intentional standards-aligned instruction and disciplinary reading. Essential 4, Essential 5. If you think I'm going to list all of the essentials, I'm not. I actually stop at 6. That's not to say that 7, 8, 9, that's not to say that the rest of them don't necessarily fit, but for me, these were the strongest, most explicit connections, and some of the others you may or may not make depending on the inquiry and the direction you travel. So the first 6 essentials in particular fit really well with what we're doing here this week and the inquiry we're using as a model. So I want to kick this off. I'm going to mute, and you guys can either unmute or throw answers in the chat. What are some things that kids care about? What do kids care about? And I will tell you right now, this is the 23rd time I've asked this question to a group of teachers. So I'll just get the obvious one out right now that someone's going to say. My hunch is it would be Matt that would say it, but I could be wrong. Kids care about themselves. I'm thinking there's some snickering going on right now in the cameras that I can't see. So either unmute or throw in the chat, what are some things that kids care about?
Food.
I heard food. I see in the chat conflicts, TikTok, the environment, technology, Fortnite, their friends, their peers' opinion of them, if they are safe, video games. I'm 41 and I still care about that. Justice, right and wrong, equity and fairness, acceptance, personal fables. I'm intrigued by that one. Well, you guys are 100% right. Kids care about all of those things, including humor. You know what I'm not seeing on this list? The Industrial Revolution. Nobody brought that up. Don't kids care about that? He says, tongue in cheek. What about, the topic of the inquiry we're studying, manifest destiny? Why isn't that?
Ask them what they do without electricity.
Well, there you go, because electricity makes some of those things on that list possible. So 100%, you're right. 100%. So one of the things in thinking about an inquiry is remembering who your target audience is, and that's students. So while they're going to be reading some things that may or may not excite them, spoiler alert, probably won't excite some of the things that they're going to read and study probably won't excite them. You want to make sure that you are trying to spark that drive and that desire to inquire about your content in some way, shape, or form. So I like to start off with this question, and in person, I have a little bit of a longer discussion, but you're on the right track. These are things to think about when you take your content and try to figure out what compelling question you're going to use to frame your inquiry-based unit. So there are both compelling and supporting questions as a part of an inquiry. And the compelling question is, there's usually one per inquiry, and then there can be multiple supporting questions. Here is a list, and we often, even Becky, Roy, and I sometimes argue about what a compelling question is and what a compelling question isn't. In those situations, I go back to the horse's mouth, and I go back to Kathy Swan, John Lee, and S.G. Grant, and some of the work that they've done. So on this list, you've got, looks like 6 questions, and some of them are compelling questions, and some of them are supporting questions. Some of you all have various wealth of knowledge of C3. Some of you don't have much at all. Some of you, you're very skilled with it. Looking at that list, which bullets on that list, and again, you can either unmute or type in the chat, which of those on those lists do you think are compelling? Without me giving you any sort of definition of what a compelling question is or isn't. Which ones do you think are compelling?
Why do we need rules?
So some of you brought up justice in the chat before, and you're absolutely right. Why do we have rules is something that may spark some attention with kids. I see 1 and 6. So why do we need rules, and who won the Cold War? Prior to, let's say, 2015, I would have said who won the Cold War might be a supporting question, because there's an answer to that, but now I'm not even certain the Cold War's over. So, I think you can make a case for that. Who are our community helpers is a great one to bring up. It may be in a secondary setting that could be considered a supporting question, because you might identify people that in the early elementary, particularly kindergarten, 1st and 2nd grade, that's a question that, who helps in our community and how. That's definitely a supporting question in the elementary grades. Can Canada and the US be best friends forever? I hate that question, but I think it was an attempt at being compelling.
Why do we need rules? Oh. That one, we actually used something like that in the MC3. I think the first civics lesson, we did something like that. And they did, they actually touched back on Lord of the Flies. So.
That why do we have rules one is sort of timeless. I mean, it works in a kindergarten classroom all the way up to your high school, your moody, morose high school senior who's sitting in the back of the room going 8 more weeks till graduation, right? That rules piece is something that speaks to kids at a variety of grade levels, the way some of these others may or may not. So you guys are good, you're identifying the right ones. And compelling questions, again, as defined by Swan, Lee, and Grant, are generally these big bird's eye view. they use the language quite frequently about a transferable topic, something that may come up again and again, maybe not in your class, but you know, in Michigan, we build US history into 3 grade levels. So you may study a compelling question in 5th grade that is just as relevant to study in different circumstances in 8th grade and in high school. And it's arguable. It needs to be something that you can actually take at the end. I kind of touched on this yesterday, right? It's to be something you can sort of take at the end and argue and be able to come up with multiple potential arguments. The other key piece to keep in mind is that it needs to be compelling to a student. Your target audience isn't the 41-year-old from Boone, Michigan, who's a history major and really, really loves to study the presidents. You know, I'm not the target audience of a inquiry that I'm delivering in my classroom. The target audience is the kids that are in your classroom, which is why I had you do that opening activity where you all talked about what are some things kids care about. You want to remove as much teacher jargon as possible, and you want to make a compelling question something that a student can internalize and take with them. So someone brought up MC3, and I'm glad that they did, because I took 2 MC3 essential questions, because essential questions are different from compelling questions. And I took 2 MC3 essential questions from high school, from high school US history. And so when I throw this first one out to you, do you feel like this is something that is compelling to a 9th grader or a 10th grader? Here's the first one. How did evolving ideas of freedom and equality influence Americans as the United States became an industrialized world power?
No.
Correct. And why not? You know, what in there, you know, where, first identify where in
Wordy.
there your students might be falling asleep. Yep, it's very wordy. And you know, if we had more time, I would ask you guys to kind of brainstorm how you could turn that into a compelling question. But you can, a lot of essential questions start off, a lot of compelling questions can come from an essential question. It just requires making sure that it's arguable, and I'm going to show you some tips for doing that in just a minute. And it also, you know, it needs to be something that a student can internalize. The other one I pulled is for the Cold War unit in MC3. How effective was American society in resolving the tensions between liberty and security while pursuing the idea of freedom for all Americans? Compelling, not compelling?
No.
You know, I can't see who's talking because I've got dual screens on here, but whoever it is, I like you. That's so yes, so that second bullet point is very important.
Did you put this on my lap? Did you put this on my lap?
Well, I've now muted.
That second bullet.
So back to you, Dave.
There we go. Thank you. So that second bullet point is just as essential as making sure that it's a big, broad, arguable topic. It also needs to be something that excites kids, right? Because we want them to take this question and go, you want to learn more about that, not, I can't understand half of the terms in it. So we also have supporting questions. And so, like I said, we have had some really spirited, fired up discussions amongst the social studies leaders in the state about what a compelling question is and what a compelling question isn't. And sometimes the argument that we hear about why you need that terminology, that teacher jargon in your compelling question is, well, without that, how do we know what we're studying? And you're absolutely right. The place for that specificity is in getting into the supporting questions. So supporting questions end up, if you think of them like puzzle pieces, you know, when you have an answer to this supporting question that has a right or wrong answer, and you have a question to this supporting question and this supporting question, and you put them all together, you should be able to piece together an answer to the compelling question. And so the supporting questions are where you bring in some of that specificity. So when I look at something like the 6 we looked at before, what are the 5 largest sources of oil for the United States market? You know, when that question was written in 2015, the answer could be different today, but there's still a right or wrong answer for it, right? So, you know, in that particular case, you're going to find some sources that help kids answer that question. And I'll get to that step of the process a little later. But you don't have to necessarily start from scratch every time you go, you know, I want to explore this through inquiry. There are already some fantastic resources out there that have gone through portions of this process to build good questions, both at a smaller lesson level and at a larger unit level. A great one is Giants, and Giants ties in heavily with Open Book. In a lot of cases, you had similar authors and contributors working on both, and they referenced each other. So that's nice. But Giants is unit level, and it's available for 3rd grade all the way through 8th grade. And Giants is unit level. So if you want to really approach a whole unit through the lens of inquiry, Giants has some great compelling questions for some of those bigger, broader topics. If you want to get down into the weeds a little bit, my Open Book also has them. I mentioned yesterday the Michigan Inquiry Hub that's going to be coming up soon. MC3, you can take some of their essential questions and make them compelling if you so desire. And you've also got the C3 teacher site where that inquiry we've been working from all week comes from. So dimension 1 of the C3 framework, you don't have to read all of these slides. Just notice it says individually and with other students construct compelling questions, and individually and with other students construct supporting questions, and individually and with other students. What I want you to recognize about dimension 1 is that we are approaching this kind of like the teacher is delivering all of the inquiries, right? I mean, you're building an inquiry if you're going for those extra sketches that will A, hopefully end up on the Michigan Hub when we launch it, and B, you know, it is delivered by the teacher to the students. But we also want to be mindful about thinking about some ways to get kids to get better at asking questions in the classroom. So I've got some resources for that I can share at a later date and time that are some strategies that you can use to get kids accustomed to starting to ask questions. Because in C3, the language isn't teachers will. In C3, the language is actually that students will start to ask these things. But no matter what your grade, that's not going to happen at the start of the year this year. That's going to take some time. And you may, at the end of next school year, celebrate that you got 1 student there, and that's okay. You know, this is something that we'll build, and as we implement this across grade levels, you know, it's going to become a little bit easier for students to do. So here's a standard, and this is out of the old draft of the social studies standards. This one has been reworded for the 7th grade, but here's a standard that came out of Michigan. It's slightly different now, but we still have something that kind of tries to piece together all of this. This standard, if you look at it, has, you know, pretty much thousands of years of history going into it, and you can't easily tackle this with 1 inquiry lesson of a week in length. So in looking at this standard, either use the chat or unmute. Remember to mute again when you're done, but either unmute or type in the chat. What are some pieces of this standard that might spark a student's interest? If we're going to recognize off the bat that we can't do 1 inquiry that hits all of this, what are the parts where you might be able to most easily spark a student's interest?
Political crisis.
Possibly political crises. You know, we're certainly not living any today.
I love the stories of demise. So like the collapse of something is really intriguing.
I think building on that, the consolidation that hints at overtaking.
Yep. Anything else? What you've all done, if we consider this, if I'm going to use the terminology from the Swan, Lee, and Grant books. So if we consider this standard or a collection of your standards, the content slice, what you guys have just done is start to examine that content slice to figure out what your content angle is. And this is all stuff you do before you start filling in an IDM template to figure out, okay, these are the standards I want to hit. Here are the interesting parts of those standards. Now I want to find the content angle. So here's a 5th grade standard. Compare the regional settlement patterns of the southern colonies, New England, and the middle colonies. You know, If we had more time, I would have you guys kind of talk out what the content angle here might be. And actually, I think we do have time. So looking at that one, which is a little bit smaller in word length, what are the interesting pieces? What are the slices that you might be able to take from this standard to develop an inquiry? Absolutely, Matt. Architecture by region. The economic piece is going to be huge. That economic piece is a strand of 5th grade that doesn't go away in 8th grade. If anything, we shine a light even more heavily on it in 8th grade than we really have time to do in 5th. And it comes back to haunt us again in high school. So that economic piece might be a good one to pull out and really hunker down and focus in on. Push-pull factors, climate, all of these are good. So when you take your chunk of content, your expectation or expectations, and you start to find that angle of how I'm going to approach my compelling question, then you're ready to start actually building your compelling question. So of the 3 books that I showed yesterday, the one that I said is my favorite uses these 3 examples throughout. And with a larger presentation, I show lots and lots of different things that you could do with these, but these are 3 compelling questions that have passed what I'm going to go through in just a minute, which is the stress test. Do people around the world care about children's rights? Is compromise always fair? And what should be done about the gender wage gap? The first one was presented as an elementary inquiry from the New York Toolkit, but I think it's just as relevant if you were to pull it up. It's just as relevant in the 6th grade world geography course. Is compromise always fair? Really hits our 5th grade content because it talks about the Constitutional Convention and the compromises that were made there. And then what should be done about the gender wage gap is a high school economics question. So a lot of the work that I would do in a longer session focuses around these questions, but some of this actually comes up in here too. So you start with your content slice and then you find the right content angle. And then you actually try to come up with a compelling question. And this is where that document that I shared via Google Docs is going to come in handy, because in working through with teachers creating an IBM inquiry, Swan, Lee, and Grant have come up with a collection of buckets that compelling questions tend to fall into. And it doesn't mean that if yours doesn't easily fit in this bucket that it's not a compelling question. It just means that after watching teachers write over 500 inquiries over the past 5 years, they have found that most compelling questions fit into one of these buckets. So the first one is broad brush. An example of that is what is justice? These are going to be big issues and are often case studies, although there's a case study option here too. And if you go full into a case study style question, you're going to look really deeply into the ideas someone had, or the actions a group of people took, or the conditions in a place. There are personalized. The personalized ones generally try to invite a student into the topic. So you're going to have words like you or I or things like that in there. An example of that is, why do I have to be responsible? And these personalized ones work the best for the pre-post. The others work well too, can work well too, but the personalized ones right out of the gate on day 1, a kid is an answer to that. And that answer can be expanded upon as we move further through studying the inquiry. There are also analytic compelling questions. There are comparative questions like, how could Americans be happier? Well, first of all, how could we be happier than who? Who are we talking about? Are we talking about how can I be happier than other Americans? Are we talking about how can we be happier than Canadians? So there are comparative style compelling questions. There are also evaluative ones where it's asking kids to make a judgment call after studying. So was the American Revolution avoidable? So in that case, kids may answer yes, it was, no, it wasn't, and hopefully bring in some of the pieces. They're going to make that judgment call with that project at the end. There are also problem-based compelling questions. There are wordplay compelling questions. Is free trade worth the price? There are ironic ones, is greed good? That one to me reads a little more Alanis Morissette ironic than actual ironic, but you can see that in this case, it's considering the medians below the surface of an idea. And then there are also mystery ones. And when I ran IDM with my teachers all across the North, I found a lot of my second grade teachers, a lot of my elementary teachers in particular, went the mystery route. You know, they took this format of what's the real story behind, and lumber was huge and is still huge up here in parts of my area. So I had like 4 second grade lumbering ones from different parts of northern Michigan that were all, what's the real story behind Lake Ann lumber, the Lake Ann lumber industry? What's the real story behind this and that? So there are some mystery-based ones. If you want to channel your inner Scooby-Doo team, try to build a compelling question that fits into that bucket. So the other thing that Kathy in particular, I've worked with Kathy a lot, that she warns about are cute questions. I look at that, can the US and Canada be best friends forever? From that previous slide, I kind of look at that as a cute question. And so when you're the challenge becomes when you're trying to make it student friendly, how far is too far and where is that line? And that line is going to be different for everyone. I don't have any tip tricks for saying you're over the line if these 5 statements are correct, but try to make it, and this is where the stress test will actually help. Try to make it student friendly, but not cutesy, not like, can we be BFFs with Canada? Justin Trudeau's dreamy. You know, don't go down that road if you can avoid it. So when you have come up with a sample question, there is one down and dirty way to decide whether or not your compelling question is truly compelling outside of making sure that students are friendly. Remember, I went back in my definition and I said it has to be arguable. When you stress test your compelling question, you're testing whether or not it is arguable. So what you do with a stress test is you take your compelling question, you take whatever compelling question that you've come up with, and essentially you sit down and ensure that your kids can come up with multiple possible outcomes for it. A lot of questions end up being like a yes, no, or maybe. It's never enough, obviously, to accept yes, no, or maybe from your students. That yes, because, no, because, maybe, because. And they've got to back it up with evidence. So the stress test asks you to take your compelling question and put yourself in 3 different students that you've had before or that you have right now's brain and say, this is an answer that I might get from Joey. So here's an answer for yes with some of the evidence that I would look for. Here's an answer for no with some of the evidence I would look for. Here's a potential answer for maybe that has some of the information I would look for. In some cases, that yes or no question always has to have justification and evidence to support it. But in some cases, that yes or no question could be yes for 2 or 3 different reasons or no for 2 or 3 different reasons. But the point of a stress test is to take your compelling question and come up with what you think the 3 most likely answers your kids are going to give you are, and summon them from the ether and put them down somewhere. You do this for 2 reasons. 1, you demonstrate right then and there that there are arguments that can be made from your question, and poof, okay, it passes the stress test. But you use those questions in building the rest of your inquiry. You use those questions to come up with not just the formative performance tasks every day, but the supporting questions themselves. If you have these 3 answers, what is the question, what is the right or wrong question that could lead students to a yes because, or a no because, or a maybe because? And when you have those supporting questions that stem from the arguments that you come up with in your stress test, those supporting questions then tell you, okay, if I want to get this answer from a kid, they need to look at source A, B, C, and D. So when you fill an inquiry, it's not, I'm going to start at the top and work my way down. You start at the top with your compelling question, you then stress test it, and that then helps you figure out what your supporting questions are going to be and what sources will go underneath them. So at the end of a stress test, you will know if your compelling question is arguable, And you will have sample argument stems that will lead you to your supporting questions and the sources that kids will study and the tasks that you'll have them do at the end of each supporting question to demonstrate what they've learned in that portion. And that is the down and dirty, quick, quick overview of building a compelling question. Now, I recognize it's a lot. And as you develop your own inquiries, you may have questions. I know Troy has been really good about getting these recaps up very, very quickly. But I'm also going to invite you over the next couple of days as you, start to delve into your inquiry. You can email any of us and we'll help walk you through the steps if I went through this too quickly. What I'm going to do with the remainder of my time, though, is I'm going to ask what questions you might have about this whiplash tour through developing and stress testing a compelling question you guys might have. And then I'm going to turn it back over to Troy, Roy, and Becky and sign off so that I can do my next session at my NPD.
Hey Dave, it's Lauren. Hey. I've been working with Oakland schools in their C3 and IDM cohort for the last 2 years. So this is something that I'm getting more and more familiar with. But I think the better that you understand it, the harder you realize this is to do well. One of the things that we've really been focusing on is the difference between like multi-day or even like a full week extensive inquiry and what we're calling focused inquiries. Is there some place that I think is the complexity of the compelling question, does it matter a little bit on how much time you're going to spend with it? Does that make any sense?
Yes.
Okay.
For example, we don't follow this process to the letter with construction of Giants units because a Giant unit is 6 weeks of study, and we're not giving them 6 primary sources to read every single day of that period of time. There's a lot of different activities and opportunities for exploration. What I know Stacy and Christopher and Sean and David Hales have done really well with that training is they've gotten into the new book. I mentioned yesterday the second book is my favorite. The third book is where my teachers are probably going to be by the end of next year, which gets into, I think it's 7 different types of inquiry, one of which is focused. And all of those, as you go through in that book and learn about them and see examples of them, all of those have a recommended timetable. Some of them are smaller and are like 2 or 3 days. Some of them are a week to 2 weeks in length. It just depends on the format you go for. And I know that Stacy and Christopher in particular have really latched onto and really like the focused inquiry, which is why they've probably been taking you down that path. And it's a great flavor of this entry-level IDM development.
Okay, yeah, that's helpful because I think it's just it's intimidating to try and come up with, like you said, a question that you're going to dedicate 5 to 6 days to, and the 3 questions, and I think knowing that it can be pared down a little bit is helpful.
Yep. Start with your slice, find your angle, build a question, stress test it, and if you follow those steps, it makes it a little bit easier to do the final parts of filling in an inquiry. What other questions might you guys have for me?
So just one question for you, Dave. Where do you find people struggle the most? Like where's the point in this process where it's just really challenging to start to transition into these questions or to reformulate these questions? Like if you had one kind of global tip to offer us here in your closing of this part of the process, what might you suggest to people about the ways in which they approach creating these questions?
I dedicated the entire first day of my training, so a 7-hour session, to going through what I just went through here. And what I find is as I did it more and more often, a grand total of like 14 times, as I do it more and more often, I can look at a compelling question that a teacher is developing and tell you right away what's going to happen at 11:45. And I generally don't stop them because it's a good part of the process to think you have a compelling question after you find your slice and your angle. It's good to go through that step of trying to argue it and recognizing, you know what? I can't argue more than one thing for this, so I've got to scrap it and start over again. That is a natural part of it. I led, in 1 year, I led 96 teachers through it over the course of 7 different ISDs. And I would say 50 of them got to the stress test and realized, you know what, this isn't a compelling question, I've got to go over. But that practice was valuable, and every single one of those 50 teachers came back from lunch, because I had that butt right up to lunch so they could have a working lunch if they wanted it, came back from lunch with a compelling question, and the rest of it was easier. So don't feel like you have to get the perfect question out right off the bat. If you follow these steps, it's designed to be as dummy proof as possible. And if you have to start over, we all know and recognize, even though most of us are type A because we're teachers, we all know and recognize there's a lot of learning in that initial failure and going back and trying again. So my biggest tip is don't be afraid to fail on it. There's enough fail safes built into that part of the process that you won't come out of it wrong.
Great, wonderful. Any final questions here? No pun intended. No, I'm turning my microphone on mute again before you activate my voice assistant. Any other things before Dave, before we transition? And thank you for joining us remotely as you're working from another school site today. We appreciate it.
My pleasure. I will see you guys all tomorrow. I'm sorry I have to duck out.
No, that's okay. All right. Bye, Dave. See
you, Dave.
All right, well, look at that. Wow, we are right on time. So we are going to turn it over to Roy and Becky here. I will double check. Yep, you both have co-hosting, so you should be able to do the screen sharing and the things that you need. Is there anything else that people should pull up on screen as we get ready to talk about the formative assessment of inquiry? Set to go.
In the agenda, there's a couple of links that you'll need during our presentation today, and we'll let you know when you need to go to them. But if you want to open those up, that's fine to have them in the tabs. There'll be a few things that you'll be working on as we move forward. So we're going into formative assessment of an inquiry. Got a lot of stuff packed in here, but I think we can be done in 40 minutes, and we can always circle back to this. And as always with all of these things this week, because now we're running that risk of getting later in the week and you get this overload, right? Well, you'll always have the agenda to go back to. And in addition to that, we'll be available to kind of support you as you continue your learning. So the same thing here as we go into this area with formative assessment of inquiry. And so as we take a look at formative assessment of inquiry, you know, where are we headed with this? And what's the why behind it? You know, why are we doing this? What's the big deal? Well, number one is we want to investigate the use of formative assessment process during an inquiry. And there's a lot of nuances around it. And so we want to give you a concrete example of one way to approach it. And so we want to investigate that today. Secondly, we want to incorporate the skills incorporate the skills into an inquiry and provide feedback to students, because one of our goals today is to help you move forward with that incorporation of not only the C3 framework, but thinking about the DLEs. And how do I reconcile those, and where do I focus, and how do I implement that and do it with fidelity? So we're going to look at a specific area of the DLEs to do that. And so that will be another thing we want to do with this particular workshop. And then lastly, we want you to experience the essential practices for disciplinary literacy instruction. So there's a couple that, like I said, we're going to go into very specifically. And we're going to show that relationship to the skills that are in the C3 framework. So that's where we're headed today. And the structure of these 40 minutes is packed with a lot of stuff. And we're going to check your understanding of formative assessment. Becky and I both need to get a sense of where you are with formative assessment in your understanding. So we've designed a set of questions to give us some data. And what we'll do with that data for this workshop is it'll influence the language we use. If we find a lot of you have a lot of background, then it's going to change the way we talk about things. If there's a mix, then that'll lead us into how we may talk about things, as well as if people have very little experience. My hunch is everybody's got some experience, we just don't know to what extent. So we'll narrow that down a little bit as well. Just so we get on the same page and verify, very quickly we'll review the components of formative assessment. Got a couple slides on that. We'll examine that first supporting question that has a formative assessment task to it. We'll take a look at that and work on that briefly, make sure we understand it. And then we're going to spend some time on, okay, so now that we've looked at that supporting question and with the performance task that goes along with it, how do we incorporate the DLEs? How does that work? And so we'll dive into that a little bit. And then we'll determine the student evidence that is needed to meet the formative assessment task. And the reason we have to do that is so you as an instructor can give the appropriate feedback to students as they build their understanding of not only the content, but they build their understanding of how to employ these skills. And that feedback is needed so they can gauge their learning and you can adjust your instruction. So that's where we're headed today. That's kind of the structure, our advanced organizer for this section. All right, so let's take a look at where you are with formative assessment. And with this, we're gonna use Poll Everywhere again. And I think we got it set up so it's gonna work fine. I have a backup if not. What I've done differently with this one that I didn't include yesterday is Poll Everywhere allows you to embed it right into a Google slide. So you notice that it didn't go to a different screen, it's right in Google Slides. And this time, instead of texting in, because of one particular new question, I'll show you a different type of question that you can design within Poll Everywhere to get different types of data from your students. So that's another underlying thing to show you here, is you do have to navigate to the URL pollev.com RMS. It's at the top of the screen. So if you do that in another tab, or you can do it on your browser on your phone, it'll work the same. If you would go there, then I will, it should show up this first question. What do you know about MDE's FAME project? And just type in some quick responses. Nothing, a lot, a little bit, what is it? Whatever the case may be. Now, right now I have show responses on. And you can see they're coming in, nothing, nothing, less than nothing. May not know the acronym, okay. Okay, someone's been involved a little bit and participated. Not afraid I'm not aware of it. Really don't know, not much. And what may happen here is because of the acronym, once I talk about it, you might go, oh yeah, I have heard of that. I know a little bit. So this is helpful. As those are coming in, I'm going to go to the visual settings and show you another feature is we can put these into a word cloud. And hopefully that will show up. Yes, it does. So that's another way to display the data as it comes in, as a word cloud. And it changes as information comes in. We can also put them in clusters. And they'll change as information comes in. And then another visual setting for this one is a spotlight. And they kind of come in a scrolling fashion. All right, so that's very helpful. I'll head on to the next question. Waiting for it to load, activate. Sorry about that. All right, we should be good to go now. So what are some words or phrases that relate to the formative assessment process? Now, this could be from your prior knowledge outside of FAME or anything that you've learned along the way. What are some of those phrases or words that really kind of hit the mark on the idea of the formative assessment process? Not graded. Okay. Yes, informative, absolutely. Another ungraded. Individual. Keep check, yes. Checking in. Common, consistent. All right. Used to inform. See, even though some of you, a lot of you weren't familiar with the FAME project, I'm now getting some data to see. You've definitely got some prior knowledge with the formative assessment project or formative assessment process. All right, going to switch over to the next one and pick up the pace a little bit now that we're familiar with this. Have you had formal training on formative assessment? That would be in a, some kind of official PD. Presenter coming in, you've done an online course, something like that. So a lot of you, okay. So there definitely is some prior knowledge there based on the last list of words that we've seen. Becky, did you notice that? And now we've got 15 who've said they've had some type of formal training.
Absolutely. And it speaks to the ongoing work and commitment that Kim Young has had at MDE and in making sure that that formative assessment is something that is really considered a statewide initiative. I think that's why we see so many folks that have received training.
Okay, just a couple more. How often do you use formative assessment? How often did you use formative assessment in your classroom last year? Okay, good. That tells us a little bit too. All right. And just two more. This one's a quick one. Now, this one here, you will click in the particular area, and right now, I think I have the responses off, so you can't see anything coming in, but it is activated. And the idea is you gotta look at these definitions and select the best one. I'll give you a moment to do that. And then click on the center of the box with your selection. Okay, so I've showed the responses, and the last few just dropped in. And just real quick with this one, those are all responses in the, or all definitions in the literature that you find about formative assessment. And the bottom left corner, formative assessment is a planned process in which assessment elicited evidence of student status is used by teachers to adjust their ongoing instructional procedures or by students to adjust their current learning tactics, is one that the FAME project has adopted. And it's the idea that the data that is brought about by these assessment is used by not only the teacher, but the students. But those are all types of definitions used in the literature. FAME is the formative assessment for Michigan Educators Project that Becky talked about, that is led by Kim Young, really wants to emphasize the use of the data by both teachers and the student. All right, last one, and I know some of the responses for this already based on previous responses. Should formative assessment scores be part of the final grade calculation? There may be a few still pondering, like, okay, which one? Because I'm being forced to do it and I know it's not right. And that's what's happening. So that may be some of the three, or you know, the district saying, I want to see in your grade book X number of formative assessments. The bottom line is formative assessment, the idea of it should be no penalty. It should never impact the student's grade because it's during learning. It's not an end product. It's an assessment of learning, not assessment for learning. Well, thanks for participating in that and giving us that feedback real quick here. And Becky, please chime in on anything I might leave out here. Just want to make sure we're all on the same page here. And here's how it kind of pulls together. And there's really 13 components that they fall under a couple of others titled sections you'll see in a minute, and then 3 overall questions. This idea of where are we going? So we make our targets clear, where are we headed? And that involves a lot of planning, of course, and learning target use in that section to set that up. Where we spend a lot of our time is having students spend, you know, what does the student understand now? We got to find out where they are in their learning. And that involves, you know, eliciting student evidence and their understanding, which we're going to talk about today and get into with one of the formative assessment tasks. And then how do we get to the learning target? And that's where all of the things that we do that help students along the way, we design activities in order to give formative feedback and in order to make instructional and learning decisions. And that's kind of the 40,000-foot piece of formative assessment process, because it's not a test, it's a process. We really answer those particular questions. FAME put out this graphic organizer, and the color of the circles of the 3 questions at the top correspond to the colors below. So you'll notice that it's encompassed in planning, and you'll see the learning target use is where we focus in on where we headed. We make that clear. It's not a gotcha, it's not a mystery. Sometimes it can be though. And where we struggle with this is when we have inquiry, or in science, you talk to your science colleagues, they say, hey, we want to have inquiry. We want kids to discover that. Well, you can still have learning targets and you can still have an idea of where we're headed, but we do it in an inquiry way. So we could have more conversation about that in a later time. We got to talk about how we're going to gather evidence from students. I did that with you just a few minutes ago with Poll Everywhere to give Becky and I some information. And then, you know, how do we get to the learning target? And that's where a lot of feedback is important. Effective feedback and descriptive are the best, and we make a lot of decisions. And the focus is all about the student and their learning. So the idea is when they get to the summative, it's not a gotcha. There's no surprises. A kid should be walking in that summative saying, I'm prepped, I know where we were headed, I've had plenty of feedback, I'm ready to go. And that's a big shift for a lot of, for some teachers over the years, but it's becoming less and less because the FAME project is just renewed 2 years ago, I think, or maybe 1 year ago, 5 years of funding, and that'll be 15 years that MDE has said, we know what the research says, this is critical to impact student learning. We're gonna invest in it, and we're gonna make sure that we continue to build educators' knowledge and understanding and skill set of implementing formative assessment. So keep the end in mind with this particular inquiry, and that is that construct an argument that addresses a compelling question. Okay, that's the end goal. So all of our formative pieces within the inquiry have to align to that. And some of these inquiries are built that you're going to have to make adjustments to the formative assessment. You just can't use the one built in as is. And we want to show you how to do that real quick with a very specific example that deals with the incorporation of the skills. And I'm going to turn it over to Becky to kind of speak to this and the incorporation of the skills.
Great. Thanks, Roy. One of the things that I think we have to keep in mind, it doesn't matter what your compelling question is. You need to make sure that not only, like we talked about yesterday, not only are you integrating your content from your Michigan standards, but you're integrating that with your skills from the C3 framework. And we talked yesterday about some of those skills from Dimension 2. So you know where to go if you want to incorporate some discipline-specific skills. They're going to be found in Dimension 2. But Dimension 3 and 4, this is really where we see a lot of the connections to the disciplinary literacy essentials, the DLEs. When you take a look at Dimension 3 in the C3 framework, that's really where we see a lot of references to reading skills, right? We want students to be able to gather research. We want students to be able to evaluate that research, and they need to be utilizing reading strategies and tools in order to determine whether or not the sources that and the research that they are gathering is credible, if it is strong and compelling. And so that Dimension 3 really leans toward a lot of the literacy practices that have to do with reading. When you look at Dimension 4, you see the same thing, but with an emphasis on writing. So which of the DLEs deal with writing, and how successful can we help our students become with regard to how do they structure a compelling, strong, effective argument in their final type of product. And we're going to talk a little bit in a few minutes about, it doesn't necessarily have to be a written essay. I think a lot of times we jump to that conclusion, but you can help students realize that they can make a claim or several or claims, and that they can use relevant evidence, and they can acknowledge competing viewpoints and even refute them in other types of products aside from just writing an essay. And so the more practice that they have with those skill set in a variety of products, the better. Roy, did you want to make any other comments about the combination of the Dimension 2 and 3 and 4? You're muted.
No, we're good. The thought I had in mind you covered, so. And want to be aware of our time too. So thanks for putting that into context. And if we think about the supporting question number 1, you know, the question is, what factors influence westward expansion? And then the formative assessment task is list the factors that influence westward expansion with 7 sources. So they look at the 7 sources. Well, if we stop there, you know, what is that? Well, it's pretty low level. It's DOK1. They create a list. It lacks complexity. And the bottom line is it's a list, right? So we want to level that up. And this is a great way to look at this and say, if I level it up, let me do it intentionally. And as Becky was talking about, be more cognizant of the skills in Dimension 2 and 3, and also their relationship to the DLEs. So that becomes the question. How might we incorporate the use of essential practices for disciplinary literacy? How do we do that? What does it look like? Well, right off the get-go, if we had more time and if we were in person all week, we would actually park on this a little bit and do a little bit of a mini inquiry task with you so that you would get into the document. You just become more familiar with it and you take a look and see if you would arrive at the conclusion, which practices in the document could we work with and fit and say in our curriculum that this particular inquiry is aligned to. And right off the bat, 1 and 2 come up really quick. Number 3, the idea of intentional standards and aligned instruction to disciplinary reading works really well too, and that's where we're going to hyper focus. We're going to go right into that. And there's a particular section of that. So as you think about working with this, do you have to do the entire practice? No, not necessarily. Remember, we talked about being intentional, but also go slow to go fast. Don't feel overwhelmed by all of this. Hone in on something that you can work with and do and meet that particular practice. You don't have to do the entire thing until you become more well-versed in it. So that's another message we want to send to you today and show you a concrete example of that. And so we focus in on this area of students applying disciplinary tools and concepts when working with text. And we're going to get specifically into sourcing and contextualization. And while we do this, there's a document that Becky and I put together for you. And there's the link in the agenda, and we can throw the link in the chat, where we've taken the piece out of the essential practices for disciplinary literacy and put it side by side with some information from the Stanford Education History Group. And the reason that we did that is that the Stanford Education History Group gives a little bit more information. We've added a few sub-questions and makes the essential practices for disciplinary literacy more clear. They both do the same thing in regards to sourcing and contextualization, but the questions that are in the Stanford Education History Group go a little bit further and we think help students a little bit more. And Becky, do you want to say anything more to that? I know I could just put you on the spot.
No, I think that the SHEG units do a terrific job of really focusing in on some of the historical thinking tools. I think that when we use those lessons, I think that we just have to make sure that we're being intentional so that when we are helping students practice those skills like sourcing or reading the silences, or, you know, you can go through the list, but that we have to be transparent in that students understand the purpose and they understand when they are practicing each one of those, and eventually what it looks like put together. And we'll talk about that, I think, too, when we get into the summative assessment piece and we start to look at rubrics.
Okay, and Troy, just so you know, we're about ready to go, excuse me, into groups. So I'll explain their task. Our timing is good to be done by 10 after, so we're in real good shape there. Have available to you the featured source excerpts from the Great Nation of Futurity. And I had to look that up, by the way, because I kept butchering it and had to look at it phonetically. And I almost did when I was saying it to you guys. Make sure you have that document available. That's the source you're going to be working with. And then also have available sourcing and contextualizing comparison, the one I had mentioned previous slide. Have those available to you. You're going to be referencing them when you get into your groups. Okay, and here's the task. We're going to be determining student evidence, okay? And this might look a little bit different for all of you. And the task that you have is you're going to first take 3 minutes to read featured source, okay? and read through it. It's a quick read, and look at the text around it, its context, do your own quick sourcing. And then in your groups, you're going to have a conversation. And that conversation in your groups is you're really going to ask the question, answer the question. If we get evidence from students in some form, and that evidence is a successful performance of sourcing that particular document, and its successful performance of contextualizing that document, what would I expect? What would be the range? What would it look like? So that when I look through my student responses, I can go, got it, ooh, on the right track, ooh, need to modify, that kind of thing. What would it be? Now, there's going to be some variability among all of you, but keep in mind a couple of things. One, middle school student, because obviously we would expect less of, not, I would say less, we would, yes, I'll say less complexity from a younger student. And obviously from a high school student, we would expect more complexity, right? So figure out where that balance is, and that's going to be, you know, it's going to still some subjectivity there, and it's going to vary, but that's okay. But the idea is you have this conversation, go, well, I think we should have this, and I think we should have this. And that's going to develop the criteria, the performance criteria for sourcing and contextualizing for this particular source. Lastly, you're going to record your responses into a Google form. I'll throw that in the chat. And there's 2 spots to type it in, and we'll take a look at that. I do want to pause now and ask, what questions might you have for us about your task when you get into your groups? Hearing none, just be aware, we only need 1 Google form per group. So point fingers at one another or figure out whoever, your adults and adult learners, so we can have you decide who's going to do that, and document that information into the Google form. Anything else, Becky?
Nope, I think that's great.
Please work quickly. We'll give you about 5, maybe 7 minutes, and then we'll take a quick look at the results. You'll have access to that results because it's a piece of data then you can use and extract. And when you do this inquiry, you'll have that evidence. Troy, I'm going to turn it over to you. Yep. And I will drop in the chat. And if I drop the Google form into the chat, they should all see it anyway, even though they're in their groups, correct?
Yeah, definitely.
Okay.
Drop that in the chat here before we open up the rooms. You'll be in a group of 3, and we will call you back at about 5 minutes past the hour here. So we'll wait till Roy gets that link in the chat room and everybody can open it. And that's also in the agenda too, right, Roy?
Yes, it is.
Yeah, so if for some reason you don't grab it from the chat here quickly.
I'm almost there. I just had to make sure I selected everyone.
That's okay.
Here we go.
It happens to all of us. We send that private message. Okay, you'll be in a group of 3. We'll call you back in about 5 minutes.
Hey, everybody. Welcome back. I was able to pop into each of the rooms. And all of you wouldn't know that because you're not in all the rooms, but I was able to hear everybody. So there were some similar things being talked about. And as I said in the last room, I'm realizing is that the timing of this, my assumption was that with being later in the week and being online and not knowing how much online PD, that we would be able to get set up faster. And I'm realizing in the future that we would probably need about 7 to 10 minutes for people to get set up and kind of get oriented, get in their room, and then another 7 to 10 minutes to work. So if you leave here today though, and this is kind of brings it together, thinking about when I formatively assess in an inquiry, I can look at the formative assessment task they give me. And I'm going to have to determine, like the first one, list factors that influence westward expansion. Is that enough to get them ready for the summative piece? And tomorrow we'll talk about setting up for that summative piece and building backwards. And we'll refer back to some of this because today is with the formative is to show the direct relationship between what you're formatively assessing and setting you up for that. So when tomorrow we can see how that supports their summative performance. So that means along the way, you got to give them feedback. And so the factors is not enough to get them going. It's a help, but we want to level it up because part of this week is to raise your level of awareness and skill set with incorporating the skills in the C3 framework, as well as the disciplinary literacy essentials. And so with that, we've got to upgrade some of our formative assessment tasks. Well, in order to do that, we got to know if a student gives me information, and in this case, sourcing and contextualization of a source, right? We use source C as best we could. What does that look like? What's it be like? So the idea was to collectively bring that together. So you kind of have that answer key, or you kind of have the performance level indicator that you would expect a middle school student to be at when you gave them some type of assessment task. So that's the idea. We'll pick up a little bit more on this tomorrow as we talk about summative, because some of the assessment literacy that you have to have as an educator now carries through. There's a big tie between the formative and the summative. And we are in a day and age over the last 10 to 12 years. It started about 10 or 12 years ago. The expectation is every educator has to have a level of assessment literacy that really requires 6 to 9 graduate credit hours, in my opinion. And that's what they're expecting of educators, to be well-versed in writing summative assessments, well-versed in fully implementing the formative assessment process. And we say it takes about 3 years for someone to implement the formative assessment process, so it's part of their daily routine. It takes time. You got to go slow to go fast. Now, as a social studies educator, you're told, oh, by the way, you got new standards and you got these literacy practices you got to build in. And, so go slow to go fast, small chunks. We'll return back to this tomorrow. We'll tie it in to the workshop on looking at the summative assessment of inquiry. We'll close with this. What questions might you have about this particular workshop for me now? We're all good. If you have any hindsight 2020, I wish I would have asked. We're obviously going to be back tomorrow, and you can always throw something in the chat as well. Thank you. I'm going to turn it back over to Troy.
Yeah, well, and actually, Roy, I'm gonna count on you for just a moment too, because I know Becky had to step out, and she was gonna carry us through these last few moments talking about these inquiry design model templates. I just wanted to note something, that the 1A podcast from yesterday is so timely with this topic of assessment, and I put the link there in the chat. It's also in the agenda, and yeah, if you're dropping notes in the chat here, these questions, and you would like to put them in our agenda to save them for later too, that would be awesome. So I'm giving Roy a moment to collect his thoughts and make sure that he's going to be able to do that. And I'll even share the screen to open both of these. We have a template from Becky that she uses with her students. And then also there are a number of templates that are available on C3 website. And then I'll make my quick public service announcement for our workshop this afternoon. If you'd like to come back at 1 o'clock, we are going to be thinking about the creation of infographics and how, as we are again inviting students to move toward taking informed action, we can use infographics as another way for them to develop a digital argument. So anything you'd want to say about either Becky's template here or the resources available on the IDM website, Roy?
Very briefly, yes. The idea is that we move you in the direction to become more comfortable with developing your own IDM, sometimes they're referred to as blueprints. I think the community is still kind of struggling. I know Kathy Swan, John Lee, and SG Grant refer to them as blueprints because they're not really a lesson, but they're not really a unit, but you could look at them that way. So our jargon becomes very important. The idea is that when you look at what is the inquiry that we're looking at this week was a Destiny to Move West. That's really a inquiry blueprint. The C3 framework essentially says, hey, if you're going to do inquiry, which is not new, it's been around for ages, right? But if you're going to do it in a social studies classroom, here's a model on how you can construct them, and the way you construct them that really builds in content and blends it with the skills. And so the template is one way to give you a framework to start building your own and thinking through of doing that. And of course, Dave, keep in mind, Dave's workshop today was the first part of that, right? You got to think about the questions, which helps you identify the content, and that leads to then development of the supporting questions and the area you want to work, which then obviously gets you to focus in on the standards. But here's the upgrade to that, because that's what we used to do in curriculum development to a certain degree. And that is making sure you build in the skills and being intentional about not only teaching the skills and making them part of your everyday instructional practices, but also so that you're assessing them in a formative way, as well as having some of them in your summative assessment. So we want to move you in that direction, but at the same time, what's great is a lot of people have already done a lot of work. So when you go to C3 Teachers, you can take a look at what a bunch of these IDMs and see how people constructed them, and absolutely borrow from those things and learn from those others. And you could easily take one of those and adjust it and upgrade it so it fits your course better, so you're not starting from scratch. There's some value in doing that as well. So we're headed in that direction to support you and move in that direction, so you become informed as well as more comfortable with thinking, I think I can design one of these. I'm moving in that direction. I'm starting to see all the moving parts and bring them into an IDM that will work for me in my classroom.
Right. Well, thank you. Someone had private messaged me in the chat. So Roy, I'm going to call you out here, and I'll put a note on the agenda. We would really appreciate links to today's slides. And I'll also make sure that I tag Dave up there on his. Any other questions for the good of the group that people need to know about, or in preparation for this afternoon's workshop?
I have one.
Yep.
Probably for Roy. And just like simple brain racking for teacher planning purposes. I know in a number of DBQ workshops I've attended, there's a lot of emphasis on timing and pace. And I've heard a couple times now, go slow to go fast with formative assessments, with probably this IDM process as well. In your experience with teachers that have done these, put them together on their own, or used ones that have already been created, like what Dave is offering and sharing, what would be the best suggestion for time frame? I know that's going to change depending on learning levels, but just like a rough estimate, 2 to 3 days, maybe a week.
The way I've answered this in the past without being elusive, because in some ways
can I pause you for one moment just to say, I think we'll let you answer that. I will keep the recording going, but it is time for people to sign out. By all means, if you have to sign out, take time to do that, and we'll see you soon. We'll keep this recording going to catch Roy's answer, because we don't want you to be elusive. We're going to pin you down. Here. But if you have to sign out, by all means, we'll see you either at the workshop this afternoon or tomorrow morning. We'll keep this recording going for a few more moments, though. Thanks.
Yeah, Chris. So the way you can go about doing that is I would work in an area where there is an IDM that you can use and make slight adjustments to, a pretty good one, and go through an IDM first and walk through it with your students. In other words, you don't set them free to do it. You model everything with them. So addressing the compelling questions, supporting questions, actually walk through the expectation and the final product with them. And then when you get to those sources and looking at those sources, you still might develop some lessons to provide some direct teaching, and then give them some guided practice on doing some of those, whatever is required of the particular IDM. And start with a smaller one that might be 2 or 3 days, that allows you to tackle a part of the content that works for you, that you're comfortable with. So that's one approach there. When And that's without considering going in and analyzing it to build in the literacy practices. So that would be maybe a next step. You might choose another one next semester. And in the meantime, you're reading the practices. You might be dabbling in some other areas with the way you've done other things. But maybe your next IDM, you say, okay, I'm going to select one or two practices and make sure I'm intentional with building those in and making sure that they're in the IDM. And again, you might go select one, and now you might have to modify it a little bit. So that's a way to go slow to go fast. The other is when you think about the formative assessment process, you might have used exit tickets, and we hear a lot, oh, I use exit tickets. And you ask, well, what do you do with them the next day though? Are you doing anything with them? Well, you know, I'm going to upgrade that. I have to use that data. So I'm going to go deliberately put kids into groups. And you might spend time just doing that. It's a quick, easy thing to do. And you get good at then doing something the next day differently from the data that you collected. It might be more formal. A way to go slow to go fast is take a couple of questions that you either redesign or pull them from a summative and give a quiz, and you set your kids up to know, you guys, I'm going to give you a quiz. You're going to have it this whatever. But here's the thing. It's not going to impact your grade, but it's going to tell you where you are, and we're going to review it together. But it is going to tell you, if you're here today, that's what your grade would be. But I want to see where you are. That's another way to build it in a little bit more formal. You do still have kids, are they going to take it serious or they're not? If they're not, the way to get them to take it serious is saying, this is a spotlight on what's going to be expected on the summative assessment where it does count. So if you take this seriously, you're going to be seeing what's expected of you on the summative assessment. And so I have talked to a lot of teachers who have said, once my students got their head wrapped around this is kind of, I get to see something that's on the summative kind of early and talk about it, you get a number of students that will take that seriously and participate in that. So there's a couple other things I could tell you to do, but that's the idea. Does that help at all? I mean, if not, we'll try again. Other questions you might have?
I was just going to say, in terms of how long it takes instructionally, and I think I shared this before, that the students, you have to, like, one unit might take, 6 weeks, and by the time they get better at it, they're going to be able to knock out that same unit at the end of a year of world history in half the time. So that's helpful for planning, maybe.
Thank you, Christy, because that is something that we have heard. We've done a formative assessment institute for 10 years. Well, this will be year 12, where we ran about anywhere from 30 to 75 people through. It's going to be different this year, obviously. And that's a common feedback that we get is when you go slow to go fast, I start slow and I start doing it. My students become more well-versed in it, and my teaching and learning expedites, and I get through more content because I just get better at it myself and my kids. So later down the road, when I say, all right, you guys, peer assessment time, you guys got to get in your 2 groups. Here's your random selectorizer. Here's the criteria you're using. Go. You're not teaching them how to do it. They know the value in it. They know they're really honing in on that criteria and working with a colleague on it and getting feedback from another student on their own performance. And when they're sold on the fact that that has something to do with the summative assessment that does impact their grade, they really buy into it. And that's a whole nother strategy. Maybe we'll get a chance to talk about that. It's been really helpful. The little technique to use at the beginning of the year to convince them to take that stuff seriously.
I think it's just helpful for teachers to know. When I first started doing it, I panicked because I thought there is absolutely no way if I do this that I will be able to, meet the criteria for standards, but you fit it and it works. So.
Yeah, and the other thing, and we'll talk about this tomorrow, this concept of sampling. We feel like we have to teach every aspect of everything of every standard. And we feel that pressure because we want to do a great job. The reality is we've got to get comfortable with saying sampling. And it is difficult with some content because we think, well, if I don't hone in on that real strong, they're going to be missing out on some of that content. That may be true. That may be true. But if you equip them to be really good learners and dive deeper, they're going to be well equipped to go on, and you're going to expedite along the way throughout the year. So thank you for that. All right.
Thank you, everybody, for another day. And I'll get
Yeah.
the links out as soon as I possibly can. We'll see you back here at 1 o'clock if anyone else wants to join the tech workshop this afternoon.